Welcome to the Nick Carlson Press Writing AMA number 2. We have a great lineup of questions to tackle, so without further ado, let's dive right in. How do you make characters seem real and not seem robotic, if that makes sense? It makes perfect sense. Sometimes when you're reading a story, you might find that characters just sound flat or uninspired, or maybe every character in a cast sounds like each other. You may know a lot about a character, but the character doesn't seem defined or, as you say, seem real. In order to rectify this, you have to consider something called character voice. And character voice is basically the way a character would communicate with other characters. This is something you can observe in real life. You can look at a person and you can infer so much about them just by the way they talk, the words they use, the gestures they make. Like, I move my hands around a lot, so you can infer that I'm part Italian. So when you're trying to craft a character for writing fiction, one exercise I like to do is I like to try and have an imaginary conversation with them in real life. For example, I will initiate a conversation as myself, as Nick, and then I'll answer back, but in my character's voice. And if you're writing a character that's distinct from yourself, you will respond with different words. You will put different inflections. Maybe your attitude will be different, stuff like that. I have written entire passages, entire chapters before, just based on the conversations I had with myself. You can also try proposing certain scenarios and placing your characters in them and ask yourself, how would so-and-so react? You might react to this scenario one way, but your character, if that character is well defined, might react a different way. It's also worth noting that a lot of writers will insert themselves into a main character, particularly a protagonist, because it's easy because they know themselves. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think that also involves knowing a lot about yourself and how to translate you onto a page. So in conclusion, learn about character voice, study the way people in your life communicate, stage fake conversations, and propose different scenarios. That's how you make a character seem real. What was your favorite animatronic from the Fazbear Frights series? I think that honor goes to Fetch from the second story collection. I liked pretty much everything about him. I liked the way he communicated, I liked the way he misinterpreted text messages, I liked the implication that not only was he interpreting text messages, but also interpreting the intent that, I think the main character's name was Greg or something. I think he interpreted the intent that Greg had in his mind, kind of psychically linked through his phone to itself. It was also one of the few antagonists in that series that actually had a distinct voice, and that was in the form of the messages it was sending back, which, if you remember from my retrospective video, I criticized the books for having antagonists that were mostly silent and nondescript and interchangeable. If you give your antagonists a voice with distinct personalities and traits, that makes them like 10 times more memorable. But if you're talking about animatronics that are non-exclusive to Fazbear Frights that still appeared in Fazbear Frights, I'll probably give that distinction to Funtime Freddy from the story Count the Ways. I just love his dialogue. Like I said in my retrospective, I could hear Kellen Goff's voice just coming out in these lines of dialogue. It was a fun experience. That was the highlight of that story, which in retrospect I was probably a bit too harsh on because the main character just annoyed me that much, but who knows. Maybe if we make a like a tier list or something. I shouldn't make promises, but you know, it could happen. It could happen. Do you even get writer's block? Of course I do. All writers get writer's block, even like creatives who don't write, who do other things, who do other passions, they get a certain block. It's like a period of creative drought. And writer's block is not indicative of your quality or talent as a writer. It happens to everyone. Anyone who has a passion and has a drive will suffer this curse. It is a shared affliction among anyone who dares call themselves creative. Which leads us to our next question, how to deal with writer's block. There is no magic pill for writer's block, unfortunately. It's all contingent on the writer himself. However, I think the first step in getting over writer's block is, again, to understand that it happens to everyone, it is perfectly natural, it is not a shortcoming of yourself. Acknowledge that it's happening, don't dwell on it, just put it behind you, find something else to do. You know, all these people who say you have to write X number of words or X number of pages to be a real writer, they are just talking out their asses. Other things you can do, and I've talked about this before, is to try and find a more stimulating environment to get inspiration from. You know, sitting in front of a computer in a square, room that doesn't change at all is not a stimulating environment. And I don't know them off the top of my head, but I think there are some studies that show that being outside, being in nature, like the shapes, the colors, the geometry is different. It's stimulating. It's different from the room, school, or office environments we normally find ourselves in. It can kind of trigger certain reflexes or instincts in the brain, and it's kind of like introducing new flavors to a plate that you didn't consider before. Just go for a walk, try and see what you can find outside, breathe in some fresh air, get yourself lost in a forest, find all the weird symmetry or asymmetry even you can find out in nature. That is my prescription for writer's block at any rate. How does a writer make a scene feel tense or scary? I've always had some trouble with it, and I'm not sure what sorts of elements go into it. So let's talk about a medium of writing that is different than short stories or novels, and that's screenwriting. Screenwriting is a very precise form of writing, and unless you are helming your own project and you have a very solid team and vision behind you, you can't afford to use a lot of creative or complex prose in a screenplay. Because a screenplay essentially is a blueprint for a movie. It is something that a DP, a director, a cinematographer can just pick up and translate to the visual medium without having to ask questions. However, one thing that screenplays do by their nature, which is something that novels don't always do, is they have a great sense of pacing. As I said before, a screenplay should be a translation from the page to the screen. You have scene headings, you have lines of action, you have dialogue, you have parentheticals, and everything has to be kind of structured on the page to kind of show how a scene is supposed to progress. With a screenplay, you'll find you can get across the timing and pacing of a movie scene just by the way it's written. You've heard me criticize the FNAF books before, where they will have this really intense action scene, but it will be presented in the book as just one giant unbroken wall of text. I have always advocated for breaking up your paragraphs, giving individual elements their own indentation, their own spacing, that kind of thing. And screenplays force you to do that because each section of the page has to be dedicated to a scene heading, an action line, a line of dialogue. So one thing you could try doing to help make your scenes more tense or scary is to watch a horror movie and then find the screenplay associated with that movie online. They're usually very common and easy to find. And then as you watch the movie, read the screenplay at the same time and see how the action lines and the scene headings and the dialogue and the parentheticals play off each other. And then take what you learned from that formatting and that pacing and try to apply it to your fiction, novel / short story writing. I've always advocated for making the way your fiction is written kind of reflect the experience you want your reader to have. And this is a very good way to start out. What devices / services would you recommend for video making? Mics, editing softwares, recording softwares, etc. You're going to find a lot of informed opinions out there for recommendations for video making. And they're all going to be different based on things from personal experience to budget to even what part of the world they're in. But considering you're here and you're watching me, I might as well tell you what I use. I am an Adobe stan. I use Adobe Premiere Pro for video editing, and I use Adobe Audition for recording audio. And for making thumbnails, I know a lot of people use Photoshop. However, I actually make all my thumbnails in Premiere because there's actually a lot of crossover between Premiere and Photoshop that a lot of people aren't aware of, and if you can find ways to kind of cheese the software, you can actually do some really cool things in terms of making a thumbnail. Adobe was taught to me in high school and college. It's an industry standard. I know a lot of people like Final Cut. I've used Final Cut. There are things I like about Final Cut, but why would you stray away from something that you're comfortable with that still does everything you want to do? So I will stick up for Adobe. As for recording audio for things that don't require me being on camera, such as video essays or narrations, I use this Blue Yeti USB mic. It does the job. It records good clean audio, especially when the gain's turned down, and I have this pop filter because Nick Carlson Press is a Plosion factory. I know a lot of people use XLR mics and they do produce better sound, but if you're on a budget, if you still want something that sounds good and professional, this USB mic was only about $120, I think. That's definitely like a Christmas and a birthday for a really good investment. But for things like this where I'm on camera, I have the Sennheiser lavalier mic. And this was a huge investment. This was probably about $600. But it is so liberating. I can walk around on camera, I could stray away from the camera, and you could still hear my voice super crystal clear. Both my hands are free. Well, both my hands are free. If you want to add a more personal touch to your videos, or if you want to make variety content, you need something that allows you to walk around and have crystal clear audio all the time. And for that, you do need a lavalier mic. What's your favorite writing trope? In horror especially, one thing that just really like tickles some dark part of my soul is when the POV will switch to that of the antagonist just randomly, like halfway or near the end of the story. I love this trope. It is such a slap in the face in a good way, a refreshing change of pace, especially if you've been sticking with, scared protagonists this whole time. This POV switch allows for great use of just creativity, exploring the mind of a different character, one who has radically different goals and perspectives than the protagonist you were following for the first 80% of the story. And most of all, it's just a lot of fun to both read and write. Stephen King's It does it, The Only Good Indians does it. I know I've done it at least twice in things that I've written. It just makes me feel so giddy and excited when I'm reading this in a story. I just love it. When will you let us out of the basement? We've been locked down here for a year. When my channel reaches 10,000 subscribers, and things are kind of slow right now, so chop chop. What is your favorite part of writing a story? My favorite part of writing a story is only seen in retrospect, and that is watching everything come together and form a cohesive whole. Every idea you've had churning around in your brain, every scene that you enjoyed writing, every scene that was a slog to get through, when you all just crunch it into a story with a beginning, middle, and end, you have all the elements there. It just makes me feel so accomplished, so grateful that I was able to put my focus on making this amazing story. And of course, everything that came before it has to lead into that feeling. It's not like everything about writing a story was painful and boring for me. But despite all the good feelings and experiences you have when writing a story, none are more gratifying than looking back and thinking, holy shit, it's done. Do you think God left us because he is scared of what he created? If God didn't leave us the first time we committed an atrocity against him, then it's unlikely he's gonna do it for any other time in history that we did. Like, if God was still with us after the fall happened, the great, big, original sin of mankind, I don't think he's going anywhere anytime soon. Or who knows, maybe we're just the weird uncle that God doesn't want at his barbecue. How do you feel about the current horror films / TV / games, and you give Poppy Playtime Chapter 3 as an example? To me, horror as a genre is the definition of hit or miss. I'll start out using horror films as an example. On one hand, you have true auteurs like Robert Eggers or Ari Aster who are creating these just absolutely amazing, compelling, well-written pieces of art that would blow every other Academy Award nomination out of the water. I don't know why the Oscars hate horror so much, but they need to get their acts together. On the other hand, you have shit like Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, which was so obviously an attempt to capitalize on a cultural meme. I am willing to bet that any old YouTuber with a tenth of the budget could have made a film that looked better, sounded better, and was 1,000 times more entertaining than whatever the hell that was. And the same applies for games too. On one hand, you have my two favorite horror game franchises, Outlast and Five Nights at Freddy's, and then on the other hand, you have things like Garten of Banban, which, does that game even actually have any, like, unironic fans? Like, seriously, I haven't met one. So yeah, horror is at a weird time right now where it's split between genuine people with integrity and people who just want to make a quick buck. And that's just the nature of the genre, because horror is, in general, very easy and cheap to make, yet it will always have an audience. It will always have people who either buy tickets or download the game from Steam or itch or wherever. So these days, rest assured that for every game or movie that disappointed you or was clearly made to cash in, you will find another game or movie that was made with passion, that was made with artistry and integrity in mind. Is fridging always bad, especially when you have a protagonist that doesn't want to fight on their own? So for those who don't know, fridging is a verb form of the woman in a fridge trope, where a character, generally a woman, is killed early on in a story, which is what compels the protagonist, usually a male, to go off on his adventure. Fridging is a weird trope for me because on its own, you know, there's nothing really problematic about it. A character, especially a loved one, dying is a very effective and relatable impetus for a protagonist to go off on an adventure. And when your protagonist is a male, it's just very natural and likely that the person who dies is someone that he loves, which is very often a woman. There's nothing wrong with this trope. That's my hot take. I think it becomes problematic, though, when you start noticing patterns or cycles, or if certain genres are plagued with this trope of female characters just solely dying for the man to go out and have an adventure. Like, maybe overusing this trope could be indicative of some shortcomings in an author's personality or writing style, or maybe that's just the kind of story he wants to write. Like, you can't and probably shouldn't infer that much from that trope. So yeah, you shouldn't let any criticism or fear of criticism of this trope stop you from telling a story you want to tell. Opinion on modern movie Marvel Syndrome quips like, "He's right behind me, isn't he?" or other dumb gags like that. Where would that actually be useful for a story? This is another thing where I don't necessarily have a problem with it on its own, but as you seem to have noticed, has become a trend in a lot of movies lately, and that's where it becomes annoying. Remember, the first Avengers movie that brought all these superheroes together and like first started this like Marvel-style trend of writing was in 2012. Like, some of you weren't even born by then. So while there's nothing wrong with these lighthearted, silly quips on their own, it's definitely an example of overuse. Audiences are tired of the quips. They are tired of the lighthearted, jokey nature. It's just meant to get a cheap laugh out of the audience. As for being useful for a story, these quips are, again, like flavor enhancers. If you want to try and set a certain tone for your story, or if you want to try and portray a character a certain way, then yeah, the quips are fine. But especially these days, if you think that using these quips is going to be a way to, you know, draw audiences or cash in on the trend, then you're just part of the problem. Are you on board with the grilled cheese and tomato soup combo? Well, that's a dumb question. It's like asking if you're on board with the food plus water combo. It's essential for survival. The grilled cheese and tomato soup combo is essential for your survival. Real talk though, I am not just on board with it, I am standing at the front railing with my arms held out, proclaiming myself the king of the world. How do you like to describe your scenes, or what advice would you give to newer writers like myself? When it comes to describing a scene, or rather setting a scene, one thing I like to do is putting myself into the eyes of the character whose POV it is. What would that character notice first? And not just what that character sees. What does that character hear? What does that character smell? Is there even something related to touch that the character can experience? Think about tangibility. Think about appeals to the senses. Think about the way you would absorb a scene. Now, one thing I would caution against is describing everything about a scene in one go. That can just be really boring and predictable. Generally, a character would walk through a scene and absorb different things about that setting. So don't reveal everything on the first go. Instead, present new information as the scene progresses organically. In terms of linguistic devices, I love using metaphors and similes. Having a good vocabulary is a must because sometimes invoking just very colorful words can just really like strike a scene into the reader's mind. And even if the reader doesn't immediately know what that word means, they can often infer its meaning through context. It is colder at night than outside. Why do people do this to me? So that does it for this AMA. I hope I was able to thoroughly answer your questions and maybe answer some questions that some of you didn't know you had. As for the next video, I'm finally going to crack this baby open and read the first book in this series. I am excited, but for all the wrong reasons. Take care. I'll see you all next time.